Ethan had always loved the little cottage nestled on the outskirts of the sleepy town of Foxridge. It wasn't grand or architecturally impressive, but it had warmth, the kind that lingered in the walls from decades of love and stories. It had once belonged to his grandmother, Helen, a strong-willed woman with calloused hands and a heart so generous it seemed to beat for everyone but herself. Ethan spent countless childhood summers there, chasing fireflies in the backyard and falling asleep on the floral couch with his head in her lap, while she read to him from old books that smelled of ink and time. When she passed away, he was only 16, still raw with adolescence and grief. But even then he remembered her promise. This cottage will be yours one day. It's not much, but it'll always be your safe place. After the funeral, life moved fast. Grief turned to paperwork, and paperwork turned into silence. His mother, Karen, had been named as Helen's executor, and because Ethan was still legally a minor, she also had power of attorney over anything bequeathed to him. There was no reason for Ethan to suspect anything at first. Karen had always handled the family's affairs, and despite her stern demeanor, he still believed she acted with the family's best interest in mind. He didn't press her for updates or ask what would happen with the cottage. He just assumed it would be there when he was old enough to move in or at least visit again. But everything changed during the spring of his sister Melissa's engagement. Melissa, 3 years older than Ethan, was a bright and bold personality, always the center of attention, always wrapped in the best of everything their family could afford. Her fiancé, Brandon, came from an equally flashy family, and the wedding quickly snowballed into something theatrical. There were rumors of ice sculptures, live string quartets, and a garden venue that cost more than most people's annual salaries. Ethan noticed how his mother's anxiety spiked as the planning escalated. He would hear her late-night phone calls, the panic in her voice as she spoke of vendors, payments, and keeping up appearances. One afternoon, a month before Ethan's 18th birthday, he casually asked when they might visit the cottage to check on it. Karen's reaction was odd. She hesitated, avoided eye contact, and finally said, "Oh, honey, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." That single sentence sent a cold shiver through him, but he couldn't yet imagine what was coming. She sat him down at the kitchen table, wringing her hands in that way she did when she was about to deliver bad news, and said with what she likely thought was a soothing voice, "The cottage was sold last month. We needed the money for Melissa's wedding." Ethan blinked. He genuinely didn't understand at first. He laughed awkwardly, thinking it was a joke. But she didn't laugh back. "What do you mean, sold?" he asked slowly. "It was mine. Grandma left it to me." Karen nodded, but didn't meet his eyes. "Yes, she did. But you were underage, and I had legal authority. Look, honey, you have to understand. Melissa's wedding is very important. It's not just a party. It's about her future, her status, her connection to Brandon's family. And we didn't have enough saved. Selling the cottage was the best solution." His chest tightened. He couldn't even find the words to speak for a moment. "So, you sold my inheritance for a party?" he whispered. "For flowers and champagne?" Karen scoffed, clearly offended by his tone. "Don't be dramatic, Ethan. You'll have your time too. Right now, this is Melissa's time. And besides, that place was falling apart. It needed repairs. It wasn't really a good place for you to live anyway." He stood up abruptly, knocking his chair back, the sound slicing through the tension in the room. "You had no right. That was mine. It was the one thing. She left that for me." Karen's voice grew sharper, "And I made a decision for the family. That's what parents do." Ethan didn't speak to her again for days. When the wedding finally came, he attended out of obligation but couldn't bring himself to smile. Melissa looked beautiful in her designer dress, and Brandon beamed as though they were royalty. Karen fluttered around the venue like the Queen Mother, receiving compliments on the arrangements and congratulatory remarks on how tastefully done the whole affair was. Ethan watched it all with a numb sort of detachment, feeling as though he were watching actors in a play that had cost him far too much to produce. Every time someone praised the floral arch or the wine selection, he heard the echo of slamming doors in that old cottage, doors that now belonged to someone else. After the wedding, he confronted his mother again, calmer this time, but firm. He asked if there was any leftover money from the sale, if anything had been put aside for him. Karen shook her head with what might have been a tinge of guilt. Every cent went into the wedding. You'll understand when you have children someday. You do what you have to do for them. He felt something shatter quietly inside him. It wasn't just the loss of the cottage. It was the realization that, in his mother's eyes, he was expendable, collateral, a silent bystander in a family where choices were made for him, not with him. When he turned 18, he moved out. He didn't storm off or cause a scene. He simply left, taking his savings, his books, and what little sense of self he had left. He rented a small room near the university where he worked part-time jobs and studied relentlessly. He didn't speak to Melissa about the cottage. He didn't know if she even knew. And frankly, he didn't care. For him, that place represented not just memories of his grandmother, but a promise, a future. And it had been sold without so much as a warning or an apology. Years would pass before he'd return to the topic. But from that day forward, something fundamental shifted in how Ethan viewed his family. The trust that had once been assumed, like an invisible thread tying him to the people who raised him, had frayed, quietly, irreversibly. He told himself he didn't need them. He'd make his own home, his own rules. No one would ever sell out his future again. The years that followed were not easy for Ethan, but they were formative. After leaving home, he juggled multiple part-time jobs to support himself while attending community college. He worked mornings at a local bookstore, afternoons as a receptionist in a dental clinic, and often closed the night shift at a 24-hour coffee shop. There were nights he came home so exhausted that he collapsed on his bed without eating. But through all of it, he never once called his mother for help. Not for money, not for guidance, not even for emotional support. His silence was not out of bitterness. It was born from clarity. Ethan had learned early that in his family, love came with conditions and attachments. He decided that he would rather build a life without it than ever risk being a pawn in someone else's plans again. In college, he studied finance, drawn to the practicality and structure of numbers. They were predictable. They obeyed rules. They didn't betray you in favor of someone else's wedding. He excelled in his classes, fueled by a quiet fire that rarely dimmed. While his classmates went out for drinks or spring break trips, Ethan saved every dollar. He built a small savings account by his mid-20s and used it as a down payment on a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't flashy. It had no extravagant design, no big garden or marble countertops. But it was his, truly his. No one else could take it from him. The deed had only his name on it. Professionally, he climbed steadily. He landed a job at a mid-tier investment firm where he worked diligently and without complaint. His bosses appreciated his reliability, and clients respected his careful, conservative approach. Ethan never chased big risks. He had lived through enough of those at home. Instead, he built a reputation for being the kind of man who kept his word, honored his contracts, and never promised what he couldn't deliver. In time, his salary grew, and with it, his savings. Still, he lived frugally. He didn't need much to be happy. Quiet mornings with black coffee, a book on weekends, and a home that no one could sell out from under him. He kept his family at arm's length. Birthdays were acknowledged with brief calls, holidays with polite texts. He sent Christmas cards, but rarely visited. Occasionally, Melissa would call, often to talk about herself. Her marriage, though once a spectacle of wealth and glitter, had unraveled within 5 years. Brandon had cheated. Twice. Then came a divorce that drained not just Melissa's spirit, but also her finances. Karen, ever the fixer, poured much of her retirement savings into helping her daughter land on her feet. Ethan watched from the sidelines, unsurprised. His mother had always viewed Melissa as the fragile one, the precious glass sculpture that needed constant polishing and protection, while he had been the quiet, resilient spare part. In contrast to the chaos of his family, Ethan's life was defined by control and consistency. He liked it that way. He dated a few people over the years, but never let anyone too close. He wasn't bitter, but something inside him had long since stopped seeking comfort in others. It wasn't that he didn't believe in love. It was just that he didn't trust it to last. Not after seeing how casually his own worth had been discarded. He told himself that some people were made for families and celebrations, and others were made for stability and structure. He'd chosen the latter, and for a while, that belief kept him warm enough. But nothing remains static forever. One crisp autumn afternoon, while reviewing reports at the office, he received a call from an unfamiliar number. He almost ignored it, but answered out of habit. It was his mother. Her voice sounded smaller than he remembered, strained and unsure. "Ethan," she said, and for a second, silence followed, thick and heavy. "I didn't know who else to call." She explained, almost apologetically, that she had been evicted from her flat. The landlord had sold the building, and with her savings nearly depleted from years of helping Melissa, she couldn't find another affordable place. She had nowhere to go. Ethan listened in silence, barely moving. The irony of the moment was not lost on him. The woman who had once sold his only inheritance, claiming she had to do what was best for the family, was now asking for a place to stay. She never mentioned the cottage. She never apologized. She simply said she needed help. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. His fingers drummed the edge of his desk. A younger version of himself might have screamed, hung up, or laughed bitterly. But the man he had become was different. He no longer needed an apology. He didn't need revenge. He had something better: agency. Choice. "I have space," he said flatly, "but I'll need some time to prepare things." She seemed relieved. "Thank you. I'll make it easy, I promise. I won't be a burden." He didn't respond to that. They discussed a rough date for her arrival, and then the call ended. He stared at his phone for a long time afterward, then turned back to his spreadsheet. Numbers, again. Predictable. Unemotional. Unlike everything else. That evening, he walked through his home with new eyes. It was a 2-bedroom townhome, compact but neat. The guest room had become a storage space for books, gym equipment, and old boxes. He began tidying, not out of enthusiasm, but out of a sense of purpose. And as he organized the guest room, another idea began to take form. One rooted not in vengeance, but in principle. He wouldn't refuse his mother's shelter, but she would live in his house under his terms, with a written agreement. No blurred lines. No unspoken expectations. Everything clear. The next morning, he called his friend Olivia, a real estate attorney, and explained what he had in mind. Olivia was initially skeptical. "You making your mother sign a rental contract?" she asked. "Isn't that a little harsh?" But Ethan simply replied, "It's structure. It's clarity. And I won't risk being manipulated again." Olivia eventually agreed to help and drafted a basic cohabitation contract. It wasn't a lease per se. It was a detailed outline of rights, responsibilities, and financial contributions. Karen would pay a small monthly amount toward utilities, agree not to interfere with the property, and acknowledge in writing that she held no ownership or residency claim. It also included a clause that the arrangement could be terminated at Ethan's discretion with 30 days' notice. When the document was ready, Ethan printed it out, placed it in a folder, and left it on the kitchen counter. The symbolism of it wasn't lost on him. Years ago, his mother had taken legal authority to sell something that didn't belong to her. Now, he would use the same language, contracts and signatures, to draw boundaries she couldn't cross. As the day of her arrival approached, Ethan felt neither dread nor excitement, just a quiet sense of control. He knew that inviting her in would be complicated. Old wounds don't vanish just because someone changes addresses. But he also knew that offering her a roof didn't mean offering her a free pass. This time, there would be no misunderstandings. When he heard her car pull into the driveway, he didn't rush to the door. He waited. When a knock finally came, he opened it with a neutral expression. Karen stood there, older, thinner, and clearly embarrassed. She carried one large suitcase and a look of cautious gratitude. "Hi, Ethan," she said softly. "Thank you for letting me stay." He nodded, stepped aside, and gestured her in. She looked around, almost nervously. "You have a beautiful home," she said. "It's peaceful." He didn't respond. Instead, he walked to the kitchen, retrieved the folder, and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, puzzled. "A contract," he said. "It outlines the terms of your stay. I'd appreciate it if you'd read it and sign before settling in." Her smile faltered. "You're serious?" she asked. He nodded. Yes, completely. There was silence for a long beat as she stared at the folder. Then she sat at the kitchen table, opened it, and began to read. Karen sat at the kitchen table, glasses perched on her nose, eyes scanning each clause of the contract with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. Ethan stood nearby, arms crossed, silent but not tense. There was no malice in his posture, only resolve. The document was clear and not overly complicated. It stated that Karen would occupy the guest bedroom, contribute a modest monthly sum toward household expenses, agree to respect house rules, including quiet hours, and acknowledge in writing that the home was solely Ethan's legal property. A termination clause granted Ethan the right to end the arrangement with 30 days written notice. For several long minutes, the only sounds in the room were the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the rustling of pages as she turned them. Occasionally she looked up at him, as if expecting to see some trace of guilt or second-guessing. But his face remained neutral, calm. When she finally reached the end, she placed the contract on the table and took off her glasses. "This feels like a business deal," she said quietly. "It is," Ethan replied. "This is my home. You asked for help, and I'm giving it. But I need structure. We've never done well without it." His tone wasn't angry, just steady. He handed her a pen and gestured to the signature line. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a barely audible sigh, she signed. "Thank you," he said, taking the paper and placing it in a locked drawer in his office. The first few weeks of cohabitation were uneasy. Karen tried to walk lightly, both figuratively and literally. She cleaned up after herself, offered to help with cooking, and even attempted small talk during dinner. Ethan remained cordial but distant. He wasn't rude, but his kindness had the crispness of a hotel concierge, polite, professional, detached. He would ask if she needed anything from the grocery store, but never inquired about how she was feeling. He answered her questions, but rarely asked any. When she talked about Melissa or the past, he changed the subject or excused himself. It became clear to her that while she had been invited into his house, she had not been invited back into his life. Karen began to notice things. Ethan's routine was meticulous. He woke early, made coffee at precisely 6:30, read the news at the breakfast bar, left for work by 7:45. His home was minimalist, quiet, and impeccably clean. There were no family photos, no trinkets, no signs of a messy or spontaneous life. Even his bookshelf was ordered alphabetically. To anyone else, it might have felt sterile, but to Karen, it was a message. Control was his armor. One evening, a few weeks into her stay, she tried to bridge the distance. "I know you're still angry about the cottage," she said while drying dishes beside him. "And you have every right to be." Ethan paused, then resumed wiping the counter. "It's not about anger," he said. "It's about consequences. You made a choice. I'm just making mine now." She turned toward him, eyes searching. "Do you ever plan to forgive me?" she asked. He looked up, meeting her gaze for the first time in a while. "I did," he said, "years ago. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. And it doesn't mean I owe you access to my peace." The words landed like a stone between them. Karen nodded slowly and returned to folding the dish towel. After that, she stopped trying to bring up the past. Still, the silence between them gradually softened, not with words, but with gestures. Ethan began leaving small notes on the fridge, reminding her about the thermostat or where to find spare towels. Karen, in turn, started organizing the pantry, folding laundry that wasn't hers, and preparing dinner on Fridays. They developed an unspoken rhythm. He no longer recoiled from her presence, and she no longer forced conversation. One Saturday morning, Ethan found her in the backyard tending to his neglected herb garden. "It was dying," she said when he raised an eyebrow. "I figured I'd try to fix it." He didn't stop her. In fact, a week later he bought her a set of new gardening tools. No words were exchanged about it. Just a box on the patio table with a receipt tucked inside in case she wanted to return it. As weeks turned into months, Karen began to understand something she had never fully grasped before. This wasn't about a house. It wasn't even just about the cottage. It was about value. About how Ethan had spent most of his life watching others be chosen over him. His needs dismissed, his pain rationalized, his inheritance liquidated like a disposable asset. She had always believed that as long as she provided food, clothes, and shelter, she was doing her job as a mother. But watching him now, measured, cautious, distant, she realized how wrong she had been. Parenting wasn't just logistics. It was loyalty. It was fairness. And somewhere along the way, she had failed that test with him. One evening, after dinner, she asked if they could talk. Ethan looked unsure, but nodded. They sat across from each other in the living room. "I want to apologize," she said quietly. "Not just for the cottage, but for everything after. For not hearing you. For not seeing how much it meant. I thought I was doing what was right. I see now that I didn't ask what was right for you." Ethan didn't speak for a moment. He folded his hands in his lap and looked down. "I wasn't expecting an apology," he said eventually. "But I appreciate it." She nodded, not pushing further. That night, he left a cup of tea outside her door before bed. It was peppermint, her favorite. He didn't say anything about it the next day, and neither did she. But it meant something. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but recognition. Even Melissa began to notice the change. She called Karen one afternoon while Ethan was out. "How's the prison sentence?" She joked. Karen chuckled lightly, but then surprised her daughter. "It's not what I expected. He's kind, guarded but kind, and he's done well for himself." Melissa scoffed. "Well, he always was the quiet one. Maybe that's why he was the only one who didn't crash and burn." Karen didn't reply to that. She didn't say what she was thinking, that Melissa had been protected to a fault, coddled so tightly she never learned how to stand on her own. That maybe, just maybe, Ethan had turned out stronger because no one had ever caught him when he fell. One Sunday morning, while organizing some of her belongings, Karen came across a faded photograph she hadn't seen in years. It was a picture of Ethan as a boy, sitting on Helen's porch, smiling with a lemonade in his hand. She stared at it for a long time, feeling the weight of years and choices settle on her shoulders. Then, without fanfare, she framed it and placed it on a small table in her room. When Ethan saw it later that week, he paused. "That's the cottage," he said. Karen nodded. "Yes, I thought it deserved to be remembered." He said nothing more, but he didn't ask her to put it away. By now, her presence in the house had become familiar. They still followed the terms of the contract, but the energy had shifted. It no longer felt transactional. It felt managed, like two people who had learned, painfully, to share space without sharing wounds. The rules gave Ethan peace, and in following them, Karen found a new kind of dignity. She began knitting again, something she hadn't done in years. Ethan came home one evening to find a scarf folded neatly on the hallway table. "Winter's coming," she said simply. He wore it without comment the next morning. Their conversations remained minimal, but their silences became less tense. When it snowed one weekend, they both stood at the window watching it fall. "Grandma used to say snow was a clean slate," Ethan murmured. Karen nodded. "She said that to me too." And for a moment, they stood there, two people bound not by sentiment, but by shared understanding. No fireworks. No reconciliation hug. Just a small, mutual acknowledgement that some things couldn't be undone, but they could be lived with. As the months passed, the living arrangement that began as a cold agreement slowly evolved into something resembling coexistence. Not quite family, not quite strangers, something in between. Ethan and Karen maintained their boundaries, but found moments, small, fragile moments, where the weight of the past didn't sit between them quite so heavily. The contract, tucked neatly away in Ethan's locked drawer, had served its purpose. It hadn't just protected his home. It had forced both of them to confront who they had become and why. Winter deepened, and Karen's health began to show signs of wear. It started with shortness of breath after climbing stairs, then progressed to frequent fatigue and coughing spells. She dismissed it as just age, blaming everything from the dry air to poor sleep. Ethan, observant by nature, noticed the change but said nothing at first. Then one morning he saw her sitting on the couch, hand pressed to her chest, her face pale and pinched. "We'll go to the doctor," he said, and for once she didn't argue. The visit led to tests, and the tests led to a diagnosis: early-stage congestive heart failure. It wasn't immediately life-threatening, but it required monitoring lifestyle adjustments, and medication. Karen took the news better than Ethan expected. "It's not a punishment," she told him in the car afterward. "It's just the body reminding me that time is real." He didn't reply, but he turned up the heat and drove a little slower on the way home. Caring for her brought a subtle shift to their routine. Ethan began grocery shopping with her dietary needs in mind, adjusting meal plans, reminding her about pills. Karen, for her part, became softer, more open. She started sharing stories from her own youth, of her rebellious teenage years, her early marriage to Ethan's father, and her dreams that had been set aside in the face of motherhood. Ethan listened, not always with empathy, but with attention. Sometimes he found himself wondering what might have happened if they'd had these conversations 20 years earlier. But he didn't dwell on the what-ifs. He had spent enough time mourning futures that never materialized. One afternoon, while sorting through an old box of documents in her room, Karen found a yellowed envelope with her name in Helen's handwriting. Inside was a letter dated a week before Helen passed away. It wasn't a will or legal directive, just a heartfelt note addressed to her daughter. In it, Helen wrote about her intentions to leave the cottage to Ethan. She acknowledged that Karen might not agree, but asked her, as a final favor, to honor the boy's connection to that place. "He needs something that's just his," the letter read. "Not because he earned it, not because he fought for it, but because sometimes love is proven by giving without reason." Karen sat with the letter for a long time, hands trembling. She realized, perhaps truly for the first time, the depth of what she had taken from her son. Not just land, not just a building, but the one thing that might have made him feel chosen, special, seen. That evening, she brought the letter to Ethan. He was in his office, reviewing reports. She knocked once, then stepped in. "I found this," she said, placing the envelope on his desk. He opened it, read silently, and then looked up. "I didn't know she wrote this," he said quietly. Karen nodded. "I think I ignored a lot of things that were too inconvenient to feel at the time." He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "It doesn't change anything," he said, not bitterly, just factually. "No," she agreed. "But I needed you to know that she wanted it for you. And maybe, in some way, that matters." He didn't respond, but when she left the room, he didn't lock the envelope in a drawer. Instead, he left it on the corner of his desk. As spring approached, Karen's condition stabilized, but her energy waned. She began spending more time on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, sipping tea and watching birds. One day, she asked Ethan to sit with her. "Do you ever think about having kids?" She asked suddenly. He smiled faintly. "I think about not repeating mistakes more than I think about children." She nodded. "That's fair. But you be a good father. You're steady. You pay attention." He didn't respond right away. "I don't know if I'm built for that kind of closeness," he finally said. "It's hard to trust when what you were given growing up didn't feel safe." Karen looked down at her hands. "I know, and I wish I could undo 1,000 things, Ethan. But I can't. All I can do is sit here and say I see it now. I see you now, and I'm sorry." That was the closest they ever came to full reconciliation. No grand hug, no tears, just truth, raw and quiet. The months that followed were slow but peaceful. Karen started writing letters, to Melissa, to old friends, even one to herself. "It helps," she told Ethan, "even if no one reads them." Ethan focused on work, kept up his routines, but something had softened in him. He began making time for a weekly chess night with a neighbor, joined a local hiking group, and even started dating again, cautiously. Then, one morning in late July, he found Karen still in bed long after sunrise. Her breathing was shallow, her eyes closed. He called an ambulance, but she passed before it arrived. The doctor said it was peaceful. Ethan sat beside her bed for a long time after they confirmed her death. He wasn't crying. He just sat, quiet and still, absorbing the finality. The funeral was small. Melissa came, dressed in black, crying freely. She leaned on Ethan during the service, and for the first time in years, he didn't pull away. He delivered the eulogy himself. "My mother was complicated," he began. "She was flawed like all of us. But she taught me that love without accountability isn't love. And that peace sometimes comes not from forgetting the past, but from choosing to live differently because of it." After the service, Melissa approached him outside the chapel. She told me about the contract, she said with a sad smile. I thought it was harsh at first, but now I think it was the most honest thing anyone in our family ever did. Ethan nodded. It gave us boundaries. And through those boundaries, we found some kind of healing. Melissa squeezed his hand. I hope I get there with my own kids someday. Weeks later, Ethan sorted through Karen's things. In her nightstand drawer, he found a sealed envelope labeled for Ethan. Inside was a handwritten note and a certified check. The note read, I sold your inheritance once. I can't undo that, but I hope this helps return a piece of it. Use it for something that belongs only to you. Love, Mom. The check was substantial. Karen had quietly sold her car and some jewelry she had kept hidden away. It wasn't the cottage, but it was something, a gesture, a final one. Ethan sat with the note for a long time, then folded it and placed it beside the letter from his grandmother. That weekend, he visited the plot where the cottage had once stood. The new owners had rebuilt it, modernized it, but the old tree in the yard still stood. He stood there for a while, hand resting on the fence, breathing in the scent of grass and memory. He didn't cry, but for the first time in a long while, he felt light. He returned home, placed the check in a savings account he labeled Helen's Peace, and used a portion of it to buy a small lakeside cabin upstate. It wasn't the same cottage, but it had a quiet porch, a creaky floor, and a view of the water. He went there on weekends, read books, and began inviting people into his life. Not carelessly, but openly. He never needed to unlock the drawer with the contract again. But he never threw it away either. Because sometimes, healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means drawing a line, holding it firm, and then slowly, carefully, inviting peace to cross it.